To understand Putin, we need to go back to St. Petersburg. We need to consider the Baltic Sea Fleet, which was run by Viktor Karchenko since 1990. After the autumn putsch had failed, he unceremoniously kicked all of the KGB men out of the fleet, to quote Catherine Belton. Ilya Treba ran the seaport, despite the state holding a 49% stake, which was 20% through Federal Property Ministry and 29% through St. Petersburg City Hall. What else was going on in St. Petersburg? According to Belton, the slush fund that extended to the seaport and then to the oil terminal itself, running through it all was St. Petersburg Tambov organised crime group. The scheme that was being run was the same as it was under communism. Raw materials were being siphoned off from state-owned companies at a very low internal price. They were then sold at the higher global price and the profits remain in a Western bank account. According to Belton, Putin had special permission to award his own quotas, licenses, and contracts for the city's so-called oil for food deals, bypassing the need to agree each one with the ministry. The main development of what was happening in the Baltic Sea Fleet and St. Petersburg was the development for this oil for food scheme. The primary aim wasn't to generate food imports, it was to create hard currency slush fund, what's known as an obshak. Anders Aslan said, "This is one big crime that has stuck to Putin." Putin had written to Moscow to obtain $100 million of goods to exchange for food. A commission found that the city did not receive any products and lost at least $92 million. When we think about Putin, there's two theories, the standard theory and the conspiracy theory. The standard theory is that he finished an unremarkable KGB career based in East Germany and then returned to St. Petersburg to become the deputy to the mayor Anatoly Sobchak. He retired with the rank of major and was involved in organised crime from 1991, but there's no real evidence that he made much money from this. There's also the conspiracy theory. This is that Putin was infiltrating the democratic community as part of a long-term strategy by the Kremlin to sabotage Sobchak and possibly have an insider to take power. Plan A was for Yevgeny Primakov to replace Yeltsin, but Catherine Belton claims that Putin was the plan B. In an address to the FSB in 1999, Putin said, "The group of FSB operatives assigned to work undercover in their government have successfully accomplished the first stage of their task, i.e. Putin becoming president." Was it a joke? Was it serious? Belton concluded Putin's rise to power did, of course, amount to a takeover by the KGB of the Kremlin. After the August 1998 financial crisis, a group including several KGB met for dinner. According to Robert Ehringer, he was told, "We know someone. You've never heard of him. We're not going to tell you who it is. But he's one of us, and when he's president, we're back." People claim that Putin is a bit like a mirror. He just tells everybody what they want to hear, and maybe this is why he went so far under the radar. Clearly, though, Putin's a bit of a bully. Anders Aslan reports he did not mind torture, at least as long as he did not have to see it. In 2007, he brought his black Labrador Coney for a meeting with Angela Merkel, knowing that she was scared of dogs. We also have some evidence of Putin's early views of democracy. In 2000, he said, "I could never in my worst dreams imagine I would take part in an election. It seems to me an absolutely shameful business. You always need to promise more than your opponent to succeed and look successful. I could never imagine that I would have to make promises knowing beforehand that things could not be done. Thankfully, the way this presidential campaign was conducted helped me to avoid this. I did not have to deceive a huge part of the population." Putin also mocked the campaign videos produced by Yeltsin. Those videos that Yeltsin did were mimicking Western-style elections. Putin referred to them as advertising, and he said, quote, "I will not be trying to find out in the course of my election campaign which is more important, Tampax or Snickers." What's Putin's vision? To some extent, Putin was unwinding perestroika and was a modern heir to Andropov. Belton says he outlined a program of a new era of state capitalism in which Russia would fuse the strong hand of the state with elements of a market economy. The country was to seek a third way that would rely on its tradition of a strong state. Putin himself said, "For Russians, a strong state is not an anomaly which should be got rid of. Quite the contrary, they see it as a source and guarantor of order and the initiator and main driving force of any change." Why did Yeltsin choose Putin? Yeltsin was seeking protection from his prime minister, Yevgeny Primakov, and efforts by prosecutors to pursue him and his family with corruption charges. Putin offered the Yeltsin family immunity from prosecution and preserved the financial empire of their acolytes, such as Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich. Those early oligarchs had helped Yeltsin. Yeltsin wanted a successor that would honour those commitments. The oligarchs were majorly tainted by their unpopularity at the time. But Yeltsin was so wary of a communist crew, he succumbed to a creeping coup by the security forces. He was so concerned about the communists retaining power, he was less aware of the fact that the KGB were doing the same thing. Catherine Belton says that the Yeltsin family's rush to save itself with inadvertent cause of Putin's rise and its world's demise. They needed a tough guy to protect their interests, and they got more than they bargained for. They thought Putin was a temporary figure they could control. Notice not everybody agreed with this. Anatoly Chubay was strongly opposed on account of Putin's KGB past. Also, a contributing factor to his confirmation as prime minister was the fact that he was being underestimated. Rivals all seemed to think that Putin could be defeated easier and he was a temporary stopgap. In September 1999, 4 Russian apartment buildings were blown up. 2 in Moscow, 1 in Volgodonsk, 1 in Dagestan. 293 people were killed in those Moscow apartment bombings. Gennady Seleznov, the Speaker of the Duma, informed lawmakers that a bomb attack occurred in Volgodonsk 3 days before it occurred. This gave some people the impression that it might have been a planned atrocity that people within the security forces may have already been aware of. In September 22nd, a resident of 14 Novoslaya reported suspicious activity to police, who found 3 sacks, including a detonate and timing device, in the basement. The official explanation was that it was an unrelated training exercise. Some argue that the security services and Putin himself were aware of this situation. Belton reports anyone seriously involved in investigating the issue seems to have died or been arrested unexpectedly. What's Putin's model? After he became president, Putin's allies, which originate from the Ozira Dacha group, which is a group of tight-knit network of loyal lieutenants, of trusted custodians. To quote Catherine Belton, they took control of country's biggest cash flows and excluded everyone else. Bank Russia was to form the core of the financial empire behind this group, and it was to spread its tentacles throughout Russia and deep into the West too. The fragments of KGB networks they'd preserved following the Soviet collapse were in a position to be revived and restored. We look at Putin's victory. These fortunes that were made under Putin were many times larger than those of the Yeltsin years. The tycoons, once known as powerful oligarchs, were now the vessels of Putin's Kremlin, and the oligarchs were completely broken by Putin during his first years in power. Putin was the figurehead of the KGB reapproachment of the oligarch power. One key dissident figure is Alexei Navalny. He revealed that the management of Transneft had stolen $4 billion while building the Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline. Navalny was poisoned with Novichok in August 2020. In 2014, Navalny was released from prison at the personal discretion of Putin, which was seen to be a PR victory prior to the Sochi Winter Olympics. He was then, however, arrested on return to Russia in August 2021 and sentenced to prison. We can think of 4 main sources of crony enrichment that happens in Putin's circle. 1. Privileged public procurement. 2. Stock manipulation. 3. Asset stripping. And 4. Privileged trade. All of them contribute to the economic network that supports Putin's regime. The reason why state enterprises are able to expand under these circumstances is by buying successful private companies and then engaged in corporate raiding. So this is when law enforcement is used as a means by which private sector assets can be seized. According to Anders Asland, the typical process would be that a manager of a state-owned enterprise would identify a well-run private company and then get the General Prosecutor's Office or a tax authority to initiate a corporate raid. A state bank or 2 state banks would then be brought in to arrange the funding. The payment received by the owner would largely be a function of the strength of their personal relations with the Kremlin. Putin could pick and choose whether or not the owner would be adequately compensated for their asset or whether they'd be penalized further by receiving very little. These privileges include easy access to state funding, unique rights to buy certain large companies. The objectives of state enterprise is political control, social mitigation, and personal enrichment of the bosses, as opposed to in a market economy where the objectives are competition, investment, technological development, and entrepreneurship. Putin's first presidential term was from 2000 to 2004, and there were some liberal market reforms and some good economic performance. There was some tax reform that many Western academics thought was reasonably sensible, such as payroll taxes being merged into a single social tax, having a single agency in order to collect those taxes, reductions in tax rates, the elimination of some loopholes. Russia adopted a 13% flat tax on personal income, and tax revenue from personal income subsequently rose by 25% in real terms as a consequence of that. The economic policy seemed to be reasonably successful. According to Catherine Belton, the early days of Putin's presidency now seem an era of wishful thinking and great naivety. There were some warning signs in Putin's first presidential term, though, that all was not right. He restored the Soviet anthem, albeit with new words. He maintained the liberal tricolor flag, but then reintroduced the Tsarist double eagle to the coat of arms. He also started to build his vertical of power. He'd already taken control of the FSB in 1998-1999, but he also took over control of television stations by 2000 and made targeted federal and regional administrations. According to Anders Aslund, Putin showed his political genius and opportunism in his selection of national symbols. Although these choices might have appeared ideologically inconsistent, each enjoyed a popular majority. The main reason for his victory in 2000 were economic recovery, the war in Chechnya, his personal charisma, and also the political formula of a strong Russia. Note that personal charisma was helped and supported by state TV, i.e. his work with Boris Berezovsky. Chechnya plays an important role here. In October 23, 2002, around 40 armed Chechen rebels stormed the Dubrovka Musical Theatre. It was likely that two main bombs from inside the theatre were fake. The Kremlin, though, linked that situation with the war on terror that was taking place and tried to draw links between the Chechen terrorists and Islamic militants. Plausible reports claim that the deaths were due to a release of toxic gas that was intended to subdue the Chechens. The death count was because of a botched operation rather than an actual terrorist atrocity. 2 years later, in September 1st, 2004, armed Chechen terrorists entered the school in Beslan and took 1,100 hostages. 777 of those were children. They demanded the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya and held the school for 3 days. 330 of those hostages died, 186 of them children. Plausible reports claim that the first explosions were in fact caused from outside the school, but in response, Putin abolished elections for regional governors. Putin was positioning himself very clearly within the war on terror. Putin's second presidential term was from 2004 to 2008. He was significantly helped by an oil price boom, and he used these rents to introduce state capitalism. But it wasn't that explicit about the objective until around 2006. Lots of large state companies were being formed 2006-2007. Nemtsov and Milov estimate that Gazprom transferred around $60 billion of assets to Putin's cronies from 2004 to 2007. According to Aslund, it was only during Putin's second term, starting in 2004, that he and his friends became truly wealthy. The main source of their wealth was Gazprom. It is difficult to comprehend what floodgates of wealth they opened for themselves. In 2008 to 2012, Putin had his second term as prime minister. He chose Dmitry Medvedev to operate as president because of the term limit at the time. Putin's decision to return as president may have been because of Medvedev's attempt to alter Putin's power structure, i.e. he was preventing state officials from serving on the board of large state corporations. There was also disagreements in Medvedev's stand with Libya, but it may well have been the fact that the issue over Libya was less important than the internal structures of Putin's financial arrangements. When Putin was prime minister and Medvedev president, this was the rise of asset stripping. There was a big increase in crony capitalism. Fiona Hill argues that Putin may not have always been intending to return as president, but he'd always had confidence in the financial system and an aspiration that Russia would be a global player in the financial system. However, The global financial crisis really shattered that illusion to Putin, and it prompted a major change in the direction of travel in terms of the control of the economic system and his relationship with the West. No longer did he see this West as this beacon of financial stability that Russia needed to emulate, and he had more confidence to articulate and outline a more coherent Russian alternative. He also seemed particularly keen on progress in the World Bank's Doing Business report, and we saw that Russia went from 124th in 2010 to 20th in 2018. It's quite interesting, the fact that this was a very measurable sign of success criteria, that not only did it not intrude on the interests of Putin in the international order, it was actually probably something that was helping Putin in those objectives and facilitated their enrichment. Some of the key factors in Putin's 2007 Munich speech were the Iraq War and the colour revolutions. Libya is also important as a factor in the change of relations between Russia and the West. Putin felt that he'd been promised that the West wouldn't intervene in Libya. A UN resolution was approved a limited intervention only. And yet Western powers went beyond this by toppling Gaddafi. Their justification was that this was on humanitarian grounds, and Putin recognized that this was self-serving. This all happened while Medvedev was president, and it gave the impression, to Putin at least, that the West were taking advantage of his relative weakness and him not being in a position of major power. Hillary Clinton's public support for Libyan protesters was deeply resented by Putin and may have justified, in his own mind, Russia's efforts to undermine Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016. According to Gideon Rachman. In 2012 to 2018, Putin has his third presidential term. According to Anders Aslund, Russia was particularly prone to crises because of its dependence on oil and gas, and the halving of the oil price in 2014 constituted a fourth crisis for the Russian economy. The first crisis was the collapse of communism. The next was August 17th, 2008, and the global financial crisis that subsequently followed. Since 2018, Putin has had his fourth presidential term, and as Absalon said, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the financial crash of 1998 left a deep imprint on Putin and the Russian elite, teaching them the importance of macroeconomic stability for the sake of political stability. Interestingly though, even though Putin has this strong emphasis on financial stability, he doesn't receive daily briefings from the central bank or the Ministry of Finance. The Security Council discusses current issues of domestic socio-economic agenda, but doesn't have any economic experts to participate in that. And Asland argues that Putin's reliance on intelligence reports makes him vulnerable to internalize their biases and their conspiracy theories. The formative moments in the development of Putin are probably threefold. The first is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The second is the Russian financial crisis of 1998. And the third is Ukraine's Orange Revolution. It was the Russian financial crisis of 1998 that Putin learned the importance of financial stability and fiscal conservatism and why important that was for his continued rule. It's not clear what Putin's values are. He's had multiple values over the years, and there are many and contradictory ones involved. Anders Aslan says that his statements about ideas appear more like opportunistic image making. His two central goals appear to be political power and the enrichment of himself and his friends. We know that he's deeply committed to the KGB, but his enchantment seems to be more to do with the methods rather than the values. His main political task is to build this vertical of power and a dictatorship in the field of law. If we look at where Putin's wealth has come from, the oil industry is split between Lukoil, Yukos, Sergevnegaz, and Rosneft. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the oil industry split into these four vertically integrated production companies. Oligarchs weren't siphoning off parts of the normal production capacity, they were bringing production back onto line. VNK went into privatization 1995. Anatoly Chuba was keen to get a market value for that, which was $1 billion, around 10 times more than Yukos or Sibneft. Khodorkovsky's Yukos bought a 45% stake for $775 million. He paid much more than under the loans for shares deals, but still accused of rigging the auction. Gerhard Schroeder, interestingly, became chairman of Rosneft's supervisory board in September 2017, which demonstrates an interesting ongoing relationship between Russian oil and gas interests and German decision-making. Today, the oil and gas industry is split between Gazprom, Rosneft, Novatek, Surgut, and Lukoil. Gazprom always remained a state-owned company. Under Yeltsin, it was under the control of its senior management, which made it much easier for Putin to obtain control. It's the largest, it's the most important state company. The systems of awarding no-bid procurement favors businessmen emerged in 2004 to 2006, and it became the most valuable listed company in the world in 2008. Gazprom has multiple objectives. The four main objectives of Gazprom are firstly, to enrich Putin's inner circle, secondly, to engage in Russian geopolitics, thirdly, to achieve social objectives, and fourthly, commercial performance. Notice that this last one is a much lesser concern, and the Kremlin considers social peace more important than profits or development. That's in the words of Anders Asland. Gazprom does have some profitable elements. It has a strong performing subsidiary in the terms of Gazprom Neft. This was formerly Sibneft and benefited from the modernization done by Roman Abramovich. There's some other state enterprises that are relevant. VEB, which has been accused of being a slush fund for big projects. Putin has access to large amounts of discretionary state funding that he can direct. Rostec, which is Russian Technologies, is a state conglomerate, seemingly cobbled together by different companies in completely different sectors. It has departments including the fulfillment of state programs, of the defense of state secrets and regional policies, which are very interesting because these sound much more like state functions than company ones. Superficially, it's an armaments company, but also includes a car company, truck company, and titanium production. This resembles a stable, almost feudal system. To quote Asland, in effect, the state corporations has transformed public property into czarist ownership. Putin is often portrayed as a strongman dictator, and we're all familiar with images of Putin showing himself topless riding horses and demonstrating his masculinity. Gideon Rashkman, though, points out that the idea of Putin as a strongman for the country was invented initially for domestic consumption only. It's the sort of anti-liberal and nationalist tide has gathered force all over the world, though. Putin has become an exemplar of a different style of leadership. It's now gone global, and he becomes a visible example of that. To try to estimate Putin's wealth prior to 2021, Nemtsov and Milov thought that he had a 6.4% share in Gazprom. It's long been disputed whether or not Putin is an owner, but it's certainly been acknowledged that there is a third secret owner with about 10% of a holding in Gazprom, where the rumors are that if that's not Putin himself, it's somebody holding it for him. That secret owner had been revealed to be Piotr Kolbin, who was a butcher, but also childhood friend of Putin. The fact that Putin doesn't demand strong stock performance, though, implies that he doesn't hold any shares, so his wealth possibly is linked to other factors. Alexei Navalny is perhaps most famous for exposing Putin's palace. This was a project that was intended to be, in the words of Catherine Belton, a comparatively modest 1,000 square metre house, but then snowballed into 4,000 square metre Italian-style palace with 3 helipads, a summer amphitheatre, a marina, and a tea house with swimming pools at a cost of $1 billion. After the 2008 financial crisis, Putin issued instructions that all the remaining funds in the Petromod slush fund should be spent on the palace instead of the shipyards and other projects in the real economy. We can think maybe of 3 types of oligarch in the Russian system. We have the allies. The allies are closely linked and supportive of Putin. We have the neutral ones who are not actively supportive but never really critical. And thirdly, we have the critical ones who are mostly in hiding, in prison, or assassinated. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, those critical ones no longer exist, and the neutral ones have been forced to become almost explicit allies. Putin's loyalty groups are threefold. There's the KGB officers, there's the technocrats, and there's the cronies. According to Anders Asland, Putin clearly requires 3 essential personality traits, and these are trust, obedience, and secrecy. Merit, efficiency, and results are of much lesser significance. The Putin system we can think of as some expanding concentric circles. At the core, there's the personal friends. These are the St. Petersburg KGB. These are national security officers. At the second level, you have the state enterprise managers. So these are people like Igor Sechin at Rosneft, Alexei Miller at Gazprom, Sergei Temshov at Rostec. These are CEOs that are running companies. They're very well paid. They have fairly low performance requirements. The salaries are typically between $25 and $50 million. At the third level, you have the private businessmen. These are the cronies. And the three main ones: Gennady Timchenko, Arkady and Boris Rottenberg, and Yuri Kovalchuk. These are named by Anders Aslund in his 29 book, Russia's Crony Capitalism. That fourth level and the expanding concentric circles is the Western offshore tax havens. The Anglo-American offshore is incredibly important for the Putin regime. The Russian elite prefer to keep their money abroad, which demonstrates the lack of security of property rights domestically. Even though they're exposed to asset freezes or confiscation, they still feel it's better to keep it outside of Russia. They need countries that have great financial depth. So one reason for having so much of this dirty money in the UK and the US is because these are the biggest global financial marketplaces. These are a sign of the strength of these systems, why they're attracting such info. The UK is particularly good on anti-money laundering, but very low on transparency because it allows so many peculiar forms of legal entities, according to Anders Aslund. One of the main reasons why America is used is because they have large amounts of companies that have relatively anonymous owners. There's a particular interesting element to real estate because this has been exempt from the Patriot Act. There's issues such as client attorney privilege, which we'd normally think of as being an incredibly important part of the legal system, but can obviously be exploited. According to Reuters, around a third of the owners of the 7 Trump buildings in Florida were limited liability corporations. Forbes estimates that the total wealth of Russian billionaires is $400 billion, but some estimate that the net private offshore wealth is as much as $800 billion. Bill Browder estimates that half of this offshore holding is held by Putin and his cronies. Putin was aided by Western companies that provided financial and legal services to the regime's efforts to confiscate their assets and to litigate their opponents. The West's big mistake potentially was viewing this cash merely as stolen money and not part of a slush fund that was being used for other strategic ends. Instead of bringing Russia into line with its rule-based system, the West itself was being somewhat corrupted. Catherine Belton has argued that it was almost as though there was a virus being injected into the Western financial system by this dirty money. Miami, New York, and London are prime locations for real estate because real estate is exempt from certain types of financial reporting. Another major vehicle for Russian wealth is Scottish limited partnerships. Interestingly, David Cameron arranged an international conference to clamp down on anonymous ownership in May 2016. He pointed out that 99,000 buildings in the UK had anonymous owners. These efforts, however, were completely derailed by Brexit. James Nickerson, writing in the New Statesman, found that anonymous offshore companies own 36,000 properties in London with a value of $156 billion. And this is not just London. The Geneva money men, for instance, had long forged ties to the top of the French elite, according to Catherine Belton. Putin's allies include Gerhard Schroeder, a board member of the Nord Stream and gas pipeline consortium, and also Silvio Berlusconi. They holidayed together in Sardinia and Sochi. Is there anything the West should do about this? Well, Anders Aslund proposes the following 5 things. He argues that we should forensically investigate assets of Russian individuals and enterprises already sanctioned. He argued we should force all beneficial owners of property to reveal themselves. We should force currency transfers to be subject to traditional bank regulation. We should ban large cash payments and boost the resources at FinCEN. He argues transparency is the greatest and most important weapon the West possess. It must deploy it with full force. Sanctions are, of course, one big weapon that the West has. And we can think of sanctions in 4 main categories: trade, financial, technological, and personal. Trade sanctions are a double-edged sword. They provide opportunities for the regime to take more control of the economy, and they can harm the public. Financial sanctions seem to be relatively effective. Personal sanctions are interesting because Putin has been highly critical of them, which suggests that they've had some bite. Aslund says the policy conclusion for the West is that it makes more sense to go after the money of the cronies, sanctioning them and their capital, and freezing their assets abroad, as opposed to trade sanctions, which affect the population as a whole. Putin's rule has been combining 3 different things: Autocracy, i.e. a strong government. Territory, and issues of fatherland and nationalism. And the church, which is orthodoxy. If you look at the history of Russia, according to Catherine Belton, you've always had these three things working together, of autocracy, territory, and the church. Under communism, it was really the Communist Party that took over from the church in terms of religion. But this is just, with the death of the Communist Party, a return to traditional values that Putin has been encouraging. How strong ideology motivates Putin is up for debate. A certain nationalism and orthodoxy are present, and definitely Russian traditionalism. That's according to Anders Aslund. Russian nationalism has been both exclusive and imperialist. It's exclusive in that it favours ethnic Russians over Central Asians or Caucasian. It's imperialist in that it is about maximising the size of the Russian Empire. As of 2019, Anders Aslund estimated that Putin's net wealth was around $100 to $160 billion. This made him the richest man in the world. Aslund says that Putin keeps it offshore because even he didn't feel it was safe in Russia. And this made him even more highly vulnerable to Western financial sanctions. Putin has always favoured macroeconomic stability. He's listened to economic liberals about reforming the economy to generate more macro stability and economic growth. Although Aslund says, tragically, Russia has reverted to what Richard Pipes has termed the patrimonial state, a state with weaker property rights than a feudal state in which everything depended on the whims of the Tsar. Anders Aslund argued that Putin has faced really three choices. He could either democratize and modernize, he could build a fascist police state, or establish a new aristocracy. And at the time of him publishing that book in 2019, it seemed like that new aristocracy was Putin's choice on where to move. It was a kind of form of a czarist, authoritarian, aristocratic system that had a hereditary plutocracy. Russian orthodoxy can be contrasted with Western liberalism in the sense that the principles of Western liberalism are things like tolerance, individual rights and social values, and also freedom of expression. By contrast, Eastern Orthodoxy extols one true faith. The individual is subservient to tradition and to the state, and a lack of dissent. Catherine Belton said Putin's KGB men had chosen an ideological rationale for the drive to restore Russian Empire that resonated with those who felt left by the wayside in the tumult of globalization, as well as with base innate prejudice. Over his regime, we saw Putin become more authoritarian. Catherine Belton said, gradually the constant kowtowing went to Putin's head. Beginning to believe in his powers as the new Tsar, he was emboldened to take tougher and more authoritarian decisions. He's probably also become more paranoid. They, Putin's men, according to Catherine Belton, believed the West was plotting to steer Kiev away from Moscow. Those who believed they were working to introduce a free market had completely underestimated the enduring power of the underlying security men. And as Aslund said, the Putin regime is an example, as an extreme form of plutocracy that requires authoritarianism to persist. There's been a large turnaround in the Russian economy. From 2000 to 2006, the amount of private ownership in oil output fell from 80% down to 45%. The number of the number of businesses that were linked to Putin increased from 20% to 55%. The share of the economy under private ownership fell from 70% in 2004 to 50% in 2012. And the share of state businesses linked to Putin went from 30% up to 50% in this same time period. Putin's foreign policy can be analysed in the following sense. The main strength of Putin's foreign policy is engineering situations that mean that he can demonstrate himself as a strong leader. That's according to Timothy Snyder. The weaknesses, though, is that he tends to follow a line of policy that advances national interests. He's unable to do that and separate it from the strength of the leader and what's actually in the interests of the Russian economy. Anders Aslund says that the falling out with the US has been threefold. Firstly, in July 2002, when the US unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Secondly, in March 2003, with the US initiation of war with Iraq. And thirdly, November-December 2004, with the Orange Revolution. Those were the three key events that demonstrated an undermined relationship between Russia and the US. The role of NATO, is incredibly important in all of this, and arguments can be made that NATO have done too much or not enough in the region, that NATO is responsible for Putin's subsequent decisions, or that the fact that he's made those decisions demonstrates the weakness of NATO. In September 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Kremlin, became president in Ukraine, but then backtracked on an EU integration deal. This prompted the Euromaidan protests in Kiev, and on February the 20th, 2014, sniper fire began. No one knows who started it. There was claims that unidentified forces fired on protesters and police. Russians blamed it on neo-Nazis. A Ukrainian security force from Berkut unit were present and then fled to Russia, dumping weapons in a lake on the way. Either way, whoever started that, 46 protesters had died within 2 hours. Catherine Belton said, cyber units working for Russia's military intelligence agency, GRU, flooded Facebook and a Russian social media network with fake stories that justified Russia's invasion and condemned the revolution as being led by neo-Nazis. Also, Prigozhin was accused of running an internet troll factory that had been behind a sweeping online effort to influence American voters to support Trump. The situation in Ukraine was therefore very important in 2014. This threat of harsh economic sanctions probably averted a full-scale invasion into East Ukraine, but Russian military were considering doing so. Catherine Belton said that the consequence of Euromaidan was that a hybrid war in which Russia's proxies battled Ukrainians' ragtag army had begun. Then in July 17th, 2014, pro-Russian separatists shot down a Malaysian Airlines passenger jet MH17, killing all 298 civilians on board. Asland says, the hot war in eastern Ukraine has continued. Russia had used all conceivable unconventional military means, including insurgency, sabotage, disinformation, trade war, economic sanctions, and cyber. Crimea was handed to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954, but confirmed by Yeltsin in 1991 when the formal dissolution of the USSR left it there. Belton says, for Putin, Crimea's annexation was the moment to triumphantly declare a new post-Cold War world order, the moment when Russia defiantly began to turn the tables on the US, refusing to bow to its dominance. This was such an important moment because Putin had denied Russian troops were in Crimea. These so-called small green men were Russian forces but carried no insignia. Putin later admitted that they were there. This was a flagrant lie and demonstrated his willingness to make explicit untruths to a global audience. There was a tentative ceasefire in September 2015. In terms of Syria, in 2015, Russia launched a bombing campaign to protect Bashar al-Assad. This prompted an increase in refugees fleeing to Europe and demonstrates Russia's contribution to the migrant crisis that subsequently mattered. When we think of Putin's military or strategic recklessness, there's a long list we can think about. In 1999, way back then, the second invasion of Chechnya was a high-risk military exercise. 2006, he ordered the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko, who was a former FSB officer that was close to Berezovsky. This assassination was authorized in central London using radioactive poisoning. In 2007, according to Anders Asland, he pioneered cyber warfare with a big attack on Estonia's government and commercial banks. 2014 was the annexation of Crimea. In 2015, potentially murdered former Russian Press Minister Mikhail Lesin in a Washington hotel. 2015, Putin intervened in Syria to save Bashar Assad. In 2016, Putin interfered in the US presidential election. In 2017, Russia interfered in French presidential elections. In 2018, Putin authorized the use of chemical weapons to assassinate Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, which ended up killing an innocent member of the public. In 2019, he ordered the assassination of a former Czech militant in Berlin. And then in 2020, he used chemical weapons to poison his political opponent, Alexei Navalny. This is a series of reckless events, more reminiscent of a terrorist state than a genuine democracy. We also see Putin courting favour with far right. In France, it's the National Front, According to Catherine Belton, Marine Le Pen's niece Marion had mingled with the leaders of Austria's right-wing Freedom Party and Bulgaria's far-right Attica Party. In Hungary, it's Jobbik, Italy, Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement, Greece, Syriza, and Germany, Die Linke. There's no real ideological basis for this link, but it's part of Russia's attempts to create some division. It ties into, quote Catherine Belton, an old Soviet dream that Europe, left without US military support, would dissolve into battle between its nation states. We also see this when it comes to Brexit. Russian support is found in the examples of Gerard Lopez, who's a billionaire who'd made money through an early investment in Skype. He's the former president of the Lotus F1 team and owner of Girondins de Bordeaux and Boa Vista football clubs. He invests in Russian infrastructure projects, and Gazprom is a major client, and rumoured to have become personal friends with Putin. Rumours of holidaying at his summer residence and feeding apples to his pets. Lopez donated £400,000 to the Conservative Party in June 2016. Alexander Termako became a British citizen in 2011, donated more than £1 million to the Conservative Party, and is a former UKOS shareholder. Finally, Aaron Banks, who donated £8.4 million to Leave.eu, it's not clear where his wealth came from. Donald Trump first visited Moscow in July 1987, following an invitation from the Soviet ambassador to the US, Yuri Dubinin. Some claim that the KGB believe that they recruited him then. It's not obvious that Trump is aware of the fact that the KGB may have believed that they recruited him. Chigrinsky and other Moscow moneymen began frequenting the Taj Mahal in 1990. Trump had significant support from Deutsche Bank, which is known to be friendly to Moscow, while having financial difficulties in the 1990s. This increased in 2000 with Bayrock. Trump paid huge sums of money for naming rights in expensive construction projects. There's been Russian continued involvement in plans for a Trump Tower in Moscow. Donald Jr. and Ivanka Trump had a private tour of Putin's Kremlin office back in February 2006. Catherine Belton, who reported all of these claims, argues that it's likely Trump was a target purely as a means to launder money, and there were no long-term political ambitions in terms of Russian interest in him as an asset. However, 1 month before the 2016 election, WikiLeaks began a series of emails hacked by the Russians from the account of John Podesta, the chairman of Hillary Clinton's campaign. Whether by luck or whether by design, Trump seems to have served some Russian purposes. We can think a little bit about Russia's geopolitics. It seems like Russia is scared by China. According to Anders Aslund, the ultimate Russian fear is that millions of Chinese will invade its depopulated Far East and exploit its vast natural resources. Also, the Kremlin sees only the United States and China as its equals, but neither returns the compliment. Although the European Union accounts for half of Russia's trade, the Kremlin continues to treat the member countries as separate entities. Anatol Levin says, they are becoming impressed with the Chinese model, a tremendously dynamic economy, a disciplined society, and a growing military superpower rolled over with iron control by a hereditary elite that combines huge wealth and deep patriotism, promoting the idea that China as a separate and superior civilization. We can think of historically 3 major examples of excessive Kremlin risk-taking. The first is the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. This led to the Russian Revolution in 1905. 1853 to 1856 was the Crimean War. Ultimately, that led to the end of Nicholas I. And then 1979 to 1988, the war in Afghanistan, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Anders Aslund argues, now that Putin has engaged in 4 wars in the past decade, he appears hungry for another small victorious war when it feels it would be beneficial for national mobilization and his domestic political standing. Hardly anyone predicted the Russian annexation of Crimea or the Russian military engagement in Syria, rendering it foolhardy to try to foresee what comes next. An oft-quoted line in official Russian discourse is, "We need a small, victorious war." Anders Aslund pointed out, Putin knows how to boost his legitimacy through small, victorious wars. He rose to popularity with the presidency on the back of a housing bombing and the fall of 1999 and the ensuing Second Chechen War. In 2003, his arrest of Khodorkovsky amounted to a war on the oligarch. It won him the Duma elections in December 2003 and then the presidential elections in March 2004. As Anders Asland said, this implies that the likelihood is increasing that the Kremlin takes on excessive risks and gets bogged down in wars that are too costly.